Here we go. Well, 1 Corinthians 7, thinking of being one church, and also today thinking about one's unmarried. That does include if you're never married, that includes if you're being widowed or if you're divorced. And this kind of completes and brings to a close our 1 Corinthians series that we've been on, but we also get to look and come back to that on camp. So we'll finish it off on camp as we look at that. Now, last week we did focus in on for the singles, we focused on marriage, and so for the singles, you may have thought, oh, there wasn't a real lot there for me, but maybe you'll be married sooner than you think, or maybe maybe you might find marriage again. So be looking for that and be listening for what God has for you today. This week, as we think about singleness, a married person may be thinking, oh, not much for me. And not much for you to hear from, but let me encourage you, you may have to give advice to a niece or a nephew, a grandson or a grandchild, and they might ask you, there's a verse in the Bible that says in verse 28 that marriage will have many troubles, and they say, what does that mean? And you're going to have to explain something or say something if you're a married couple. So we'll look at this together, and let me encourage you, like I did last week, and if you weren't here, I talked about having marriage mentors, and I think that this is a really important thing, and I want to really advocate for it. And my wife wasn't here last week either, but I need to talk to her about people that we could invite into our marriage to be someone who's ahead of us along in their marriage years, 46 years maybe. We're not up to that, but it'd be good to have people who are in front of you in that walk, who can meet with you maybe just regularly once a month, or pray with you, or even coach you through a part of your marriage. So I really encourage that, but I also encourage then if you're a single person, or if you're not a single person, that you might want to think about how you find someone who can be a mentor to you in that situation as a single person. But today is what I've called, does anyone know what, here we are, getting through to there. Do anyone know what SMS stands for? Who's sent a text message? Put up your hand if you sent a text message before. If it doesn't have a photo and it's just text, it's an SMS, short messaging system. Yeah? And you might, we might change this acronym to mean, for 1 Corinthians, it could be single, married, single. Everyone starts off single. Some people get married in the middle and often end up single at the end. So I think it fits for here as well. Also today, as Greg's already alluded to, we'll have S for Sister Elaine will be sharing. We'll have M for me in the middle, and we'll have Sister Sue sharing at the end as well. So SMS all the way around. And I think it just really fits for 1 Corinthians if you think about singleness, marriage and sex, and that's the last thing, that's what we've been looking at for the last 2 weeks, really. So, SMS series, SMS in 1 Corinthians 7. So we're going to start off with singleness. And you may find yourself single if you're wearing a shirt like this, so be careful on what shirt you choose. But we're going to start with singleness, and we're looking at verses 7 to 9. And I've got a kind of question with each one, and it's the gift and the good. Is it really a gift? Is it really good? So that's what we'll start with. Have a look there in verse 7, and he starts, Paul's writing, I wish that all of you were as I myself am. So we'll start with Apostle Paul. Paul was himself the writer, and he's responding in a letter to the Corinthians, the Christian Corinthians. He's over in Turkey, in Ephesus, and he's writing across the Mediterranean to the people who are in Greece. That's the people in Corinth. He says in different places that he is a Pharisee of Pharisees. He's the son of a Pharisee, and he is a Hebrew of Hebrews. And if someone of that pedigree, it's very unlikely that you would not be married. So, but Paul says here, I wish that you're all as I am. So we try to work out, well, what are his marital status then? It could have been that he was deserted. You know, he had a 3-day blinder. Not the blinder that you might be thinking of, but he was blind and he couldn't see for 3 days, and he got converted. And maybe that his wife of the time wasn't up for that. And like he talks about in chapter 7, husbands and wives in mixed marriages, maybe she chose not to stay, but probably unlikely that he's deserted or divorced. More likely that he's probably widowed, and that he says to remain as you were when you were called. But he goes on to say that I wish that all of you were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. And so he talks of this as a gift. The gift of singleness, or that gift, what he is talking about. You might be thinking, well, if I'm a single person, I don't really feel like it's a gift. And that's maybe because you don't have the gift. If you're feeling that you're not that comfortable with being a single person, or maybe that's because it's something you are getting or God is getting you used to. Or it may be you don't feel like it's a gift because it was only short term, you only had it for a little while, in a season in life, and it might be that it was just given for a season and you didn't think it was much of a gift. But I think of that with my children, that I have gifts that I've given my children that have only been for a certain time in their life. They kind of grow out of it, or they change things, and they don't have those gifts anymore. And sometimes my children aren't that excited about the gifts that they get. Like if one of my children got a book, not very excited. The art museum, or you get a gift voucher to go to the museum or the art gallery. Not that excited about it. But sometimes we need to grow into those gifts, and we need to actually discover what God has for us in them. So later on in the letter, in chapter 12, he'll talk about the gifts of the body, and how there's different gifts that are good gifts, and therefore the good of the body, the church. And that may be hard to hear for you if you're struggling with singleness. But we see that it is a good gift, and we're reminded here that it is a gift from God, and it is for the good of the body. Now, later on in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, Jesus will talk about the gift. I encourage you to go and read 1 to 19. We didn't do it together, but if you read 19, chapters 1 to 12, Jesus is talking to people there about marriage and divorce, and then his disciples ask him a question, and they think it's better not to get married then. And he says, well, actually, it's a gift that is actually given, and you need to choose to embrace that gift if you have that gift, the way he talks about it. Funny way he talks about it is like he talks about a eunuch. Does anyone know what a eunuch is? If you don't, reproductive systems don't work, and for a male, testicles not working, or did I say that word in a sermon? Okay. So Jesus says, you know what? You can be born that way. He says, you know what? Some people are made that way. And you go, kind of what? Made that way? Well, in those days, if you had a man looking after a harem, or a king had a guy looking after his harem, they could do certain things to them to mean that they don't disturb the ladies and do other things. So some people are made eunuchs, Jesus says, and other people actually choose that for the sake of the kingdom. And so he says, and he talks about it there, Jesus himself talks about it as a gift. Not for all, but for those that can choose to do it. Is it a gift? Yes, it is. Is it good? Well, we go on to see in verse 8, it says, to the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. Now again, it might be a struggle for some people to hear that it's good. What does he mean it's good? He mentions it earlier in the chapter, in chapter 7. And in church history, really, I suppose sometimes it waxes and wanes from elevating celibacy to elevating marriage. And sometimes we idolize those things even in the Christian world. And so we idolize celibacy, and married people, Christians, are felt like second-class citizens or second-class Christians. Other times we elevate marriage, and celibate people feel like they're second-grade Christians. So we've got to be careful about how we do that. And we see in the Catholic Church with celibacy, and they've said that is good. But if it's not gifted from God and it's enforced, then you see great problems which the Catholic Church has had. So we need to be careful about that. Now, whether you are widowed, whether you're divorced, whether you're never married, you have to consider if it is the gift that God has granted to you and given you. And you have to consider if it's good and how God might use it. Now, in the case of Paul, you consider his singleness and how God used a man to do what he did. To write nearly a third of our New Testament, 2/3 of our New Testament. God can use all sorts of things, and when you think of Jesus' life, a life of singleness too, and what he brings in the life in the case of Christ, which we come to celebrate in this season. Now, there's a little bit from me sharing on singleness, but I really want to invite Elaine now, Sister Elaine, to share a little bit of how that journey has been for her. And she's brave enough to do this today and willing to do this, so I hope that you are ready to listen to what God has put on her heart and what she has to share with us. Thank you, Elaine. And here comes the microphone running down by a very helpful young man.
Brave is the word. When Trent asked me to do this, I said, thanks. But then when I got to thinking about it and what has eventuated from it, I say thank you so much. It's been a very interesting week. And I think I've found a lot of things about myself that I hadn't realised and about my life's journey. I have enough information up here to write about 6 books, I think, as I've gone through my life. What I've done, I've tried to stand back and look at my life as a whole, how it started, how it developed, and how it's finishing. I was raised in a very loving Christian family. We lived in I'm living now in exactly the same spot that I lived in as a child. So I didn't get very far in this world. But we were all poor, everybody in the street, I think everybody in the town. But we were very good attenders at the Methodist Church. And we grew up in that. And I knew all about Jesus. I got prizes for Sunday school exams from Sydney, and I was really it. Until one day I realised that I didn't really know Jesus. And that happened when I was about 16, I think. I was working soon after that, and we had a great lot of young people. They really were, because I was one of them. And typically, all the young things were thinking about, we're going to get married, we're going to have a family, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. After I'd been working for a little while, I had enough money. We used to have Marcus Clark's salesmen come around door to door, and I lay by a hope chest. I can't remember what they called it, but I paid £100 and paid it off over a year for this glory box. I called it a hope chest in those days. And all the girls were sewing and crocheting and embroidering and making beautiful things for our hope chest. But then I was a little bit older, I think it's about 65 years ago. So I wasn't real old then. And we had a speaker came from Sydney. He was a Christian archaeologist, and he took a series of lectures. And that became the turning point in my life. He opened up the scriptures in a way that I've never seen or heard before. And God spoke in such a strong way that I knew that I had to give my life totally to God. And the verse of scripture that really changed my life, if I just find it, because this is not the old-fashioned translation, I can say that, but this one's the New Living. So, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all He has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind He will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship Him. Don't copy the behaviour and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will know, you will learn God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Now those two verses carried me through to this day. And as I think back to what I finished up doing, and I haven't got time, I've got 5 minutes by the way, I started on a journey. And as I looked from a distance over this week, I can see that in every crossroads of life, every pothole that I faced in the journey, every little diversion, every little detour, God was there directing. And I can say that just spoke to me this week again, how blessed I've been. A lot of you know what I've been doing. I look across there and I see Alan. My first job was working for a doctor, and I can remember the morning that Alan's mother came in with this little bundle in her arms and said, "We're calling him Alan Edward." And I had a nurse. I guess I have missed a lot of things, the obvious things, but God is so good, and He never lets you get tested beyond what you're able to cope with. And He's done that. And my life has been blessed. Now, I haven't had children, but some days I've had children. I worked out in my head that in the years when I had the preschool, which I think was about 18 years I worked there, I had input into the life of nearly 2,000 children. And that was just brilliant. Those years, I still meet the kids and their parents and their grandchildren. And we talk about those days. I didn't miss out on children. My sister was very kind. She had 4. So firsthand, I had lots to do, and she probably wished me out the door sometimes because I loved her children as if they're mine. So I did miss out on things, but God has been so good. I believe I've been privileged to be single because the work that I've done I could never have done with a husband and a family, depending on the husband, of course. But the road that God chose for me was for me, and I just almost can't express how thankful I am for the journey that I've been on. I've been privileged to remain single, not because that was Paul's advice or even my choice. This was his call on that day, and that is still the call of God in my life. When I came to know the Lord, I knew that I was saved by His grace. Now we all know that verse. God saved you by His grace when you believed. You can't take the credit for it. It's a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it. Then it's followed by this verse. For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Jesus so that we can do the good things He planned for us long ago. And I do believe that that's what God has allowed me to do. And I'm not quite sure what's around the corner or how much time I've got left now, but that commitment hasn't changed.
Thank you. Will you thank our sister Elaine? If you're looking for a single person, you're looking for a mentor, great place to start with Elaine, yeah? And thank you for being brave enough to share and see what the Lord has for you even in this week. Appreciate it lots. Okay, secondly, we'll move on to the second part of this passage, which goes basically from 25 through to 38, and it's thinking about the idea of engagement and the idea of a question I got, to marry or not to marry. Dun, dun, dun. So it's Passion Week, as we go into Passion Week, and I've been teaching the kids at Scripture for Jesus to die or not to die. So that was the big question for him, will he die or not to die? I don't know if they correlate with marriage and not to marry, but I suppose if you go into a marriage thinking that you'll die to self, marriage will go in a good direction. In the version that you have here, the ESV, it has the idea of betrothed, which is of a young person, a virgin, possibly slightly arranged, more than we'd appreciate or have in that culture, in Jewish culture. And a betrothal in Jewish culture was more like a marriage in some ways, but it wasn't consummated, or not living together. The two hadn't become one yet. That happens at the marriage. And to actually separate or not to go through with the betrothal was a little bit more like a divorce in a way, to pull out. And that's why I remember when Joseph was married and he had decided to divorce her quietly. So it was more like that. So that's the kind of context in which we see this next part. And in verse 25 I just want to point out a couple of principles as we think about this. Because there's two principles which I see here and which I see coming up, and it's the principle to remain. So in verse 26, this comes up, he says, I'll start from 25. Now concerning betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of this present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. This principle of remain, he goes on to say in a bit before, because if you notice I've cut out a section in your printout there. He says in verses 24, if you look up in your Bible, if you got it there, he says, brothers, each man is responsible to God, should remain in the situation in which God has called him. And if you jump up to verse 17, he says, nevertheless, each one should retain the place of life that the Lord has assigned him and to which God has called him. So I see this principle of remaining and the situation that you're called when you are a Christian, it seems here, when you become a Christian. He goes on to talk about in that middle, in between that, if you're uncircumcised, don't seek to be circumcised. If you're a slave, don't seek to be necessarily to be free. If you're single, don't seek to be married. And so he expounds that principle. But he says, if you do those things, you have not sinned. So in verse 26, as you have another look with me, he says, I think that if you're this present then, down to 28, he says, but if you do marry, you have not sinned. and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. So how does this work? It doesn't mean that if you became a Christian when you're a young person and a teenager, that you're determined to be unmarried for your life. It may not be your gift. And a little story from me, I think it was about 21, I decided and made a bit of a conscious choice that I was going to pursue the single life. And it wasn't that long after that someone asked me, what age do you think is a good age to get married? And I thought, 24, that's the prime age to get married. 24 is a good age to get married. By that stage, I was about 22 and a half. And so I'd been thinking about this for a little while. Not long after that, I started to recognise someone. And this person flew into church, and then flew out of church, and then I crossed her path again. And then I very quickly realised that I don't have the gift of singleness, and then I was engaged and I was married 1 month after I turned 24. 1 month after. But he gives the principle of remaining. And verse 26, he talks about this current stress or this current crisis. And really it's an epidemic of immorality that's happening in Corinth. And it's hard when you think about it to make a good choice in an intense period of time, or when you're under pressure or stress. You need, the time to make wise choices. You don't need a crisis to be hurrying you on. So it's kind of what it points out here, it's a wisdom decision at that point about what you do. Even though he encouraged them to remain, but think about it, and it's a wisdom decision. He is realistic about the reality, and he points that out, which I hinted to in verses 28, the end of 28. And then he kind of spells out what that looks like in verse 32, so follow along with me. He says, I want you to be free from anxiety. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how he can please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. The unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, except when she's planning an engagement party. Oh, sorry, it doesn't say that. On how she can be holy in her body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. And so he talks about this reality. A single person isn't worried about the washing and the wet weather as much as a married person with lots of kids. And they're not worried about the lunches which have to be made, which people like which meals, if everyone's going to like the meals, which clothes are fitting which person in which season, which kids are fighting, sleeping, which kids are schooling, and how they're going at that. And so a single person doesn't have to have the concerns of these things, or even the libido of their spouse. Their attention is divided for a married person. And it's kind of like this. If you've ever had a conversation with a parent with a young toddler, their interest is divided, right? They're trying to have a conversation, but they've got to keep their eyes on someone who's running away over here. And so their attention is divided, and rightly divided, because their responsibility is greater at that point for a littler person. But he's realistic here about the reality. I think this is a principle that comes up and is at work here. To remain. And the other principle that I see at work here is to recognise the times, which starts also in verse 26, because he mentions there the present crisis. He's talking about the low level of sexual ethics which is happening in that place, the immorality which is rampant. And in verse 29, if you jump back up to 29, he says, this is what I mean, brothers, that the appointed time has grown very short. In verse 31, if you jump down to that, he says, for the present form of this world is passing away, at the end of verse 31. We're in the end times, he's saying. The time between the time of Jesus' first arrival has come. We're waiting for his second arrival. And so we're in the end times, and this world is passing away in its current form. Marriage will be a thing for this world only, because they all point, and every marriage is a representation of the real marriage, which is the critical one, which we learn about in Revelation 19, the wedding supper of the Lamb. That's Jesus to his church. And Jesus says about the resurrection of people, there's neither marriage nor people given in marriage in Matthew 22. Life's short, eternity is long. And that was one of the things that was a driving force in me thinking about going into full-time paid ministry as well. But the conclusion comes to us on to marry or not to marry, verse 38. Did you notice there? If you've been looking, he says, "So then he who marries his betrothed does well. Good on you. It's a good thing. It's right. It's proper. But he who refrains from marriage will do even better. Better with regards to responsibilities and even the opportunities that God gives you to focus your attention in other places." Now that concludes our second part, and our third part, which I just want to briefly talk on, and then we're going to hear from Sister Sue. And I speak these things sensitively because I know that there are people who have recently been widowed, and it might be hard to hear words like free and happy. And how can you be free? How can you be happy? So I say these things carefully. Free, what is he talking about? Well, let's have a look at verse 39 and 40. So it says, "A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, and if her husband... a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet it is my judgment she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God." Free. Free in what sense? Well, he's talking about freedom, not free and easy, but free to remarry. But he has to be a Christian. Is the thing that he lines it up with, which really links in with what he says in 2 Corinthians in chapter 6, where he talks about if you know about being yoked together. He's not particularly talking about marriage there, but I think the principle applies. And free, also free not to marry, to make that free choice, and may be happy on that journey to do that. But it is a journey to take. Happier in what sense? Not happy that you have had a loss, because that's what happens to people that are widowed. It may be that for some case there is a sense of happiness because of an abusive situation or a prolonged death situation. There is a sense of slight happiness. But happy more, I think, in that there is less responsibilities and opportunities which you might not ever have had. So Paul, in his humble, God-given, Spirit-filled, life probably experience lived, says that there is happy contentment that can be found and opportunities like none other before. And so I leave you with those things, but I want us to hear from someone who has journeyed this of recent times. And Sue, are you ready to share a little bit with us?
We only had 5 minutes. I've got minus 5 minutes. Okay. Big breath. Didn't know what to expect, so I don't know what I'm going to expect. I was 58 years old when my husband had a bicycle accident near our home that started him, my family, and myself in a horrific journey of 2.5 years of pain, fractured dreams, dashed hopes, and huge losses. All things I certainly didn't see coming and I couldn't have prepared for. Yet my faith in God held me and stopped me from staying in the pits of despair, which I very much have been in and out of since 2014. The story of that journey is for me to tell at another time. It is still painful to think about, as he was rendered totally incapacitated, unable to speak or eat, move himself, or live a normal life. Among the other hard things, I had to put him, among other things, I had to put up with the pain of putting my handsome, young, intelligent, vibrant, loving, gorgeous, wonderful husband into a nursing home to be cared for by others. Nigel was a local GP here in Austinville and was much loved by many. He passed away on Anzac Day 2017, and that first year after was a relief from the pain of seeing him suffering day after day. Now it's a different journey. That of navigating widowhood and living alone. That's my place. Oh my God. Oh, thank you.
Keep going, please.
Okay.
I'll be here with you.
I've got to read through the tears. Hang on.
Yeah.
A very different household now, from having a busy family of 4 active children, an extraordinarily happy marriage, and the wonderful things that went with that. I really dislike that word widow. I think we need to have a competition of inventing another word. I came up with weirdo to our girls group. That Mary and I lead, so we had a bit of a laugh about that. It's good to laugh. But I know there are many of you girls here in this room that have your own painful story to tell, both divorced and widowed. And I want to honour you all today and acknowledge that you are loved, valued, and important in God's kingdom. And I'm so sorry for the years that I had no idea of how you might be feeling. It's not certainly a walk in the park, not only emotionally but in practical ways. But I'm finding that God is helping me in those areas too. Thanks, Catherine. Like Tuesday, got a wrong place. With all that rain, I've got water tanks out the back of my house. Live out of town, and the connecting pipe between the water tanks came apart. And I was thinking about it in all the rain. I'm thinking, oh, I'm not even going to go and look because I can't do anything anyway. But I went and had a look, and sure enough, it had come out. And I'm pretty strong. Go to the gym. But I'm not strong enough to put those pipes back in. And it was 10 to 6. I was just about to go up and do a bit of shopping, because when you're alone, you can go and do your shopping anytime. And I thought, oh, who can I ask at this time of night to come and help, because it needs to be done. And everybody's, getting ready for tea and family time. And so anyway, I prayed and asked the Lord, and He said, and I remembered Ben. Lord put Ben in my mind. Mary's Ben. He's with her staying for a short time. He's just come back, and he's strong and good handyman. And so I ran up and I said, oh, look, can come? And he said, oh, sure. And I went and picked him. I was on my way up the street to do the shopping, so I went and picked him up and brought him back. And he did that for me, so it was so good to have that fixed. And I said, well, while you're here, I've been hearing some things running around in the roof. Can you get up in the roof and try and find out what's making noise? I felt like a possum because it felt so loud at times. Anyway, so he got up, and I put one of the other guys at home, Mark, put some rat bait up there one time for me. And he said, oh, I can't see anything. I can smell that there's been something up here. But they've been nibbling at the rat poison. So, okay, that's good. I can relax about that. So wherever it's gone, it's going to die. Whether it's in the roof or it got out, I don't know. Don't have to worry about that anymore. And then he helped me. I said, oh, I need the letterbox fixed and da-da-da. So he's going to do that for me down the track. So I felt like the Lord, answered my prayer of who could I ask at that short notice. And there's many lessons I've learnt along the way. I could, a bit like Elaine, I could write a book as well, but I know I'm short in time. I know God is with me, and I have to continually choose to have perseverance and courage. Actually, I've had people praying for me for courage this morning. And fancy, I've said two things, but I'm usually so quiet in church, and I said something at the beginning, and then I volunteered for Tim, and I think, oh my gosh. And then when I had to read out those scriptures about the pain of what they went through, that really affected me, so gosh. I did have courage this morning. So I also have to work at finding contentment and fulfillment, and to be intentionally thankful and consciously surrender to a life circumstance that I didn't choose or want, but one that has been dealt to me. Paul had his thorn in the flesh. I've got my thorn in my heart. But I know that I don't have to walk this journey alone, and I'm very thankful for the many, many variety and wonderful friends that are here today, and many outside this church too, that love and continue to help and support me. I also have to, and I have to choose to not get down in the dumps and anxious. And there's other things I was going to share, but I think I'll stop. I just wanted to share with you a verse that the Lord has given me this last week. Well, there's lots of verses this last week. I'll just read out a couple of them. One was just today. Let my passion for life be restored, tasting joy in every breakthrough you bring to me. Hold me close to you with a willing spirit that obeys whatever you say. And that's my heart. It's always been my heart when I was married, to obey the Lord. And I really, really want that for now as well. And another scripture that has come this last week, someone gave me, I can quickly find it. It's from Isaiah. And though the Lord give you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, yet your teacher will not hide himself anymore. But your eyes shall see your teacher, and your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. When you turn to the right or when you turn to the left. And where I had husbands, helping in some of those areas, I don't have that anymore. And I do have friends, but I've also got my Heavenly Father, who is my teacher, and I'm going to see him more and more, and closer and closer, I hope, and pray as the years go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Give Sue a big encouragement of praise. Certainly encouraging. I just want to finish with us saying on verse 40, what do you think? Paul tells us what he thinks, and he gives us those divine word of God. But there's been a lot for us to think about, and very thankful for those that have shared, and maybe something's stirred in your heart. Good chance for you to share with them over our morning tea time. So take that opportunity. Let me pray to finish this off, and we'll do that.